The Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, was simple to use. Push a cartridge into the slot, press the rectangular power button, and play. However, millions of households learned a different ritual. Push the cartridge in, watch the power light flicker red, watch how the television screen scrambles, and then groan when the console resets itself over and over until someone pulls the plug. That blinking LED light wasn't a loose connection warning or an indication of a broken console. It was a sign of a failed negotiation happening inside the machine, one that most owners never even knew existed. The way to fix it was also simple. Just blow into the cartridge shell, wipe the edge connector fingers with a cotton swab, pull the cartridge out, push it back in, and try again. There were cleaning kits at electronics counters for this exact purpose, and often enough, the cartridge worked on the next attempt, though the blowing had nothing to do with it. In fact, moisture from blowing could bridge corroded gaps for a moment, but the real fix was reinsertion, giving the pins a fresh chance at contact. The NES didn't show any error message, no on-screen prompts or printed diagnostics. It could have been a failed authentication or just ordinary dust or corrosion. The symptoms were masked as the most common complaint, and nothing about the console's design told anyone otherwise. For players, cartridge compatibility seemed like a matter of physicality. If a cartridge fit in the slot and matched the bus, then the console would at least try to run it, right? The NES changed that. Beneath the RF shield and Phillips head screws on the console motherboard set a small epoxy chip package that read 10 NES, and its only job was to decide whether the cartridge had permission to run. Likewise, a matching chip lived inside every licensed cartridge, with identical silicone running the same code, differentiated only by how a signal pin was wired. The motherboard chip sent a signal, and the cartridge was supposed to answer. If the answer matched, execution continued, and the game operated on screen. If the answer failed or never arrived, the console forced a reset over and over indefinitely, producing that familiar power light pulse. The Japanese version of the NES, called the Famicom, was made without this chip. It wasn't an engineering requirement, but a market requirement. When Nintendo introduced the NES to North America retailers in the mid-1980s, the home video game market had recently collapsed under a mountain of low-quality releases, and warehouse shelves still carried unsold cartridges. Retailers thought that another cartridge-based system would be a liability, so convincing a toy buyer to stock one more console was not easy. The answer was to offer them control over what could be published, how many titles a single company could release per year, and who was allowed to make cartridges at all. The official Nintendo seal appeared on every licensed cartridge box, as well as the instruction booklets and the warranty registration card. For a store buyer still wary after the last collapse, the seal was like a safeguard. It meant someone up the ladder had already filtered the inventory. The dust sleeve tucked inside the gray cartridge shell, the glossy cardboard packaging, the registration card, all of it signaled a controlled pipeline. But the question no one asked on the shelf was, approved by what? The 10 NES chip was the answer, a perfect mix of hardware compatibility and business permission. Every licensed publisher signed a contract before receiving access to the matching authentication chip, and that contract governed things like production volume, exclusivity windows, and submission to quality review, including a cap of 5 titles per publisher per year. This was a strict enough limit that at least one major publisher created a separate subsidiary company just to release more games. The chip required the license required the contract, and the contract required submission to manufacturing controls and release scheduling. You could think of it as an electronical handshake between the cartridge slot and a publishing agreement, a production facility, and a retail distribution channel. Without the chip, a cartridge's edge connector fingers could make physical contact and still be refused. Manufacturing approval, royalty flow, and shelf access all ran through one funnel soldered to the circuit board. It was also important that, from a consumer's perspective, the whole thing was invisible. Everything still looked the same, whether the chip inside carried a licensed authentication circuit or not at all, and the difference could only be felt if things failed. Power on, red light blink, reset, silence. Service technicians at repair counters saw this all the time. Consumer return slips piled up with "game won't load." Worn 72-pin connectors set on repair benches. A cleaning kit could solve a contact problem, but nothing a consumer did could solve an authentication rejection. The system also came with other kinds of pressure. Companies wanted to publish compatible games without accepting Nintendo's licensing terms, such as title caps, exclusivity clauses, production controls, etc. So now they faced a very specific engineering barrier. The console refused any cartridge that could not complete the 10 NES handshake. Several companies tried cartridge-carrying circuits designed to complete or circumvent the authentication check, and they would look different, coming in plain black shells, baby blue ones, or carrying no official seal. They would reach store shelves through independent distribution channels outside what was sanctioned. Of course, there were legal disputes. Court filings and binder clip document stacks accumulated as Nintendo pursued claims against unauthorized manufacturers who argued that compatibility with a consumer product should not require a private signature. Patent diagram pages and legal brief covers circulated through proceedings that would define what platform control even meant. This was no longer just about copying a chip. Could compatibility itself be privately permissioned? Could a hardware maker use silicone to decide who participates in a market and who doesn't? And it wasn't just about publishers. This also affected users graphically. A gray game console purchased in one country, used in the same spring-loaded tray, inserted in a console sold in another region, would fail the handshake. It was also the same code on the ROM, same plastic shell outside, but the wrong electronic signature on the authentication chip. Eventually, new consoles replaced the edge connector with optical disc trays and the chip handshake with online activation servers. But the principle is the same today, and not just in video game consoles. Every modern App Store approval process, every firmware signed update, every region-locked media player carries a descendant of the same idea. The check moved from a chip to a server, but the slot never fully reopened, so to speak. Years later, Nintendo itself released a redesigned NES that quietly removed the lookout chip entirely. It could be considered a concession, built into the hardware, that the system had caused more trouble than it prevented. The original NES sits mostly in closets now, its spring-loaded cartridge tray worn down, its 72-pin connector oxidized. If someone were to plug it in, push in an old cartridge into the slot, and press the rectangular power button, it's possible that the red LED light would blink once again. The screen would flicker and reset. There is still no error message, no explanation, no diagnosis. It's just evidence of a cartridge slot that stopped being an interface and became a checkpoint.